Welcome to this remarkable frontier chronicle, where forgotten wisdom and unexpected innovation collide with tradition in ways that would forever change the course of local history. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time of day or night you found this story. It's always fascinating to see how far these frontier tales travel and when they reach you. The year was 1837. Winter had already claimed the higher elevations of the Wyoming Territory with a ferocious early snowfall that caught many settlers unprepared. But in a remote valley nestled between the Bighorn and Wind River ranges, one solitary figure moved with deliberate purpose. His name was Jeremiah Calloway, though few people knew him by anything other than Silent Cal, a moniker he'd earned not from taciturnity, but from his uncanny ability to move through wilderness without disturbing so much as a fallen leaf. The bitter winds that had driven most trappers down to more hospitable elevations seemed not to touch him, while others retreated to the safety of trading posts to wait out the cold months. Calloway remained, a decision that perplexed even the most hardened mountain men who occasionally crossed his path. What they didn't understand was that Silent Cal possessed a secret, one that would later be documented in fragmentary notes from a military surveyor in 1861 and recorded more fully in the territorial records of 1869, then forgotten for nearly a century. Calloway had developed a cooking method that produced virtually no smoke and left no detectable scent, a technique that allowed him to prepare hot meals in hostile territory without alerting either human enemies or predatory animals to his presence. The story of how he perfected this method and how it sustained him through months of isolation when others perished would become legendary among the few who knew of it. But the tale was nearly lost to time, buried in the territorial archives until an amateur historian uncovered it during restoration efforts in 1957. The military record notes that Calloway had been a trapper for the American Fur Company before striking out on his own in 1835. The company ledgers show he was methodical, precise in his deliveries, but curiously unwilling to return to established forts or trading posts, except when absolutely necessary. The few colleagues who were interviewed about him described a man obsessed with self-reliance, who studied the techniques of every culture he encountered with scientific attention. According to statements recorded in 1869 by Judge William Harrington of the Wyoming Territorial Court, Calloway had spent 3 seasons observing native cooking techniques across the territories. He had studied the Dakota firehole methods of the Sioux, the earth pit cooking of the southwestern tribes, and the stone heating techniques used by tribes throughout the mountains. But Calloway's innovation was to combine these approaches with his own modifications, creating something entirely new, a hybrid cooking method that would keep him alive and well-fed through 3 winters in territory where other men starved or froze to death. What made Calloway's story so compelling wasn't just his survival, but how his technique became a matter of significant historical record. The territorial archives contain a remarkable series of depositions taken from 5 separate witnesses who credited Calloway's method with saving their lives during the devastating winter of 1842-1843. These testimonies were gathered during a land dispute that unexpectedly revealed the extent to which Calloway's technique had spread among a select group of frontiersmen. The records are precise about dimensions, materials, and methods, unusual for frontier documentation of the time, which tended toward the general rather than the specific. This level of detail suggests the territorial authorities recognized something significant in what might otherwise have been dismissed as just another trapper's tale. What follows is the account pieced together from these territorial records, military reports, and the journal fragments of those who encountered Calloway during his years in the high country. The first recorded observation of Calloway's method came from Lieutenant James Wilson, a military surveyor who, in March of 1839, found himself separated from his detachment during a late-season blizzard. Nearly dead from exposure, Wilson stumbled upon Calloway's winter camp and was astonished to find the trapper comfortably preparing a hot meal despite temperatures well below zero and winds that made conventional fires impossible to maintain. The man had constructed what appeared to be a simple depression in the earth, Wilson wrote in his report. Yet from this hollow came a steady heat sufficient to cook meat thoroughly without producing visible smoke. The design showed evidence of considerable engineering insight, with channels carved precisely to direct airflow and contain heat. The lieutenant noted that while he had seen Native Americans use ground pits for cooking, Calloway's method was distinct, more efficient, and remarkably smoke-free. Wilson's documentation included rough sketches of the design, but these were filed away and forgotten until the territorial hearings in 1869 brought them to light again. By that time, Calloway himself had disappeared into the Western Territories, but his influence remained. The subsequent testimonies revealed that his cooking method had spread among a small community of mountain men who valued its advantages, not just for stealth but for fuel efficiency in timber-scarce areas. The winter of 1837-1838 was particularly brutal across the Western Territories. Weather reports from Fort Laramie documented temperatures dropping to 30 degrees below zero for weeks at a time, with snow accumulations that made travel nearly impossible, even for experienced frontiersmen. It was during this winter that Calloway's method was first put to the ultimate test, according to testimony from Edward Blackwell, a trapper who encountered him in early spring of 1838. "I had given him up for dead," Blackwell stated in his deposition. No man could have survived that winter in the high country without substantial shelter and provisions. Yet there he was, lean but strong, when most men who'd wintered in established cabins with ample supplies were gaunt and sickly. When I asked how he'd managed it, he showed me his cooking pit. The ingenuity of it struck me immediately. Here was a way to cook hot meals without announcing one's presence to every hostile party within miles. What made Calloway's cooking pit different from conventional earth ovens was its complex ventilation system. Traditional pit cooking relied on heated rocks to slowly cook food, but produced smoke during the heating process and left a lingering scent that could attract unwanted attention. Calloway's innovation was to create a dual-chamber system with a sophisticated air intake that functioned like a primitive rocket stove, burning wood so efficiently that virtually no smoke was produced. According to the testimony of Thomas Byrne, a former trapper who later became a rancher in the territory, Calloway would dig his primary chamber approximately 18 inches deep and 12 inches in diameter, small enough to require minimal excavation, yet large enough to cook substantial meals. The second chamber, connected to the first by a narrow tunnel at the bottom, was dug at an angle about 2 feet away, creating a chimney effect that drew air into the fire and produced intense heat with minimal fuel. The remarkable thing, Byrne testified, was how he lined the pit and tunnel with flat stones gathered from creek beds. These weren't just placed haphazardly. He selected specific types of stone that could withstand intense heat without cracking. He'd arranged them with the precision of a mason building a chimney, creating a structure that would last an entire season with minimal maintenance. Equally important was Calloway's method for sealing the cooking chamber. Unlike traditional earth ovens that were open to retrieve the food, potentially releasing telltale aromas, his design incorporated a stone cover that could be sealed with mud, containing both heat and smell. A small vent hole, which could be plugged when not in cooking use, allowed precise control of the airflow. The historical context of Calloway's innovation is important to understand. The 1830s were a period of increasing tension in many parts of the Western Territories. The displacement of eastern tribes was creating new conflicts, while competition for diminishing beaver populations had made formerly peaceful hunting grounds more dangerous. Under these conditions, the ability to remain undetected while still maintaining proper nutrition was invaluable. Traditional frontier wisdom held that one had to choose between comfort and safety, that hot meals meant smoke, which meant potential detection. Many trappers resigned themselves to cold rations during dangerous periods, sacrificing nutrition and morale for security. Callaway's method challenged this conventional thinking, offering a third path that demanded more initial effort but provided superior results. The territorial records include detailed testimony from William Hargreaves, who encountered Callaway in the winter of 1841 and observed his cooking method firsthand. Hargreaves, who later became a respected guide for military expeditions, described how Callaway would prepare a fire in the main chamber, using only small dry sticks that produced intense heat but minimal smoke. Once the fire had established, he would add slightly larger pieces of wood, always maintaining a small, hot fire rather than a larger, smokier blaze. What struck me most, Hargreaves testified, was how he prepared the food before placing it in the pit. He would wrap meat tightly in leaves, usually from wild grapevines he'd gathered and dried during summer months, then add various herbs, both for flavor and to mask any scent that might escape. He'd place this package on the stones at the bottom of the pit, then cover it with more heated stones before sealing the chamber. The genius of the system was that it functioned on multiple levels. It was a cooking method, yes, but also a security system. In territory contested by hostile tribes and frequented by predators like wolves and bears, the ability to prepare hot food without advertising one's presence was invaluable. Furthermore, the stone-lined pit retained heat for hours after cooking was complete, providing warmth without the need for a conventional fire that might be spotted from a distance. According to Hargreaves, Callaway had perfected his method through trial and error over several seasons. The earliest versions had produced too much smoke or failed to generate sufficient heat for thorough cooking. The breakthrough came when he began to study how blacksmiths' forges created intense heat through controlled airflow, a principle he adapted to his cooking pit by carefully calibrating the size and angle of the air intake tunnel. He was no simple trapper, Hargreaves stated. The man had the mind of an engineer. He would speak of airflow and combustion with the precision of a scientist, though where he acquired such knowledge he never said. What's certain is that he approached wilderness survival as a series of problems to be solved rather than hardships to be endured. This systematic approach extended to every aspect of Callaway's frontier existence. The territorial records include testimony from multiple witnesses who noted his methodical approach to site selection, shelter construction, and food storage. In each case, conventional frontier wisdom was analyzed, tested, and either adopted or improved upon based on practical results rather than tradition or habit. The most detailed description of Callaway's method came from Samuel Reston, a former military scout who testified that Callaway had saved his life during the winter of 1842. Separated from his unit and suffering from a leg injury, Reston had been found by the trapper and taken to his winter camp. There, over the course of 2 months, he observed and documented Callaway's techniques while recovering from his wound. What many failed to appreciate, Reston testified, was how the man approached the entire process as a system rather than just a cooking method. He selected his campsites based on access to specific types of stone needed for the pit lining. He gathered and dried certain plants during summer months specifically for their properties when burned or used as wrappers. His wood selection was equally methodical. He preferred certain hardwoods, broken into small pieces rather than larger resinous logs that would produce more smoke. Reston's testimony included a detailed account of how Callaway would test stones before using them in his cooking pit. He would place potential pit lining stones in a conventional fire overnight, then examine them the following morning for cracks or signs of splitting. Only those that withstood the test were incorporated into his cooking structure. This careful selection process ensured that his pits would not fail catastrophically during use, a failure that could have deadly consequences in winter conditions. He had no patience for the carelessness he observed in other trappers, Reston stated. He would say that in the high country, There was no room for error and no excuse for failing to learn from experience, whether your own or others. His cooking method embodied this philosophy: careful preparation and attention to detail that eliminated unnecessary risks. Reston's testimony included observations about how Calloway would maintain several such pits in different locations throughout his territory, never using the same one for more than a few days at a time. This rotation minimized the risk of detection and prevented any single site from developing the telltale signs of repeated use that might attract unwanted attention. The practical advantages of Calloway's method extended beyond security. In the harsh conditions of winter in the high country, nutrition was a constant challenge. Traditional jerky and pemmican provided basic sustenance, but the monotony of such rations took a psychological toll over time. The ability to prepare hot, properly cooked meals even in the most adverse conditions provided not just physical benefits, but maintained morale during the isolated winter months. He ate better than most men in established camps, Reston observed in his testimony. He could take the same basic provisions, dried meat, preserved berries, root vegetables, and prepare them in ways that made them seem like fresh fare. The cooking pit allowed him to slow cook tough meat until it became tender, to combine ingredients in ways that cold rations would not permit. This variety kept both body and spirit strong through the darkest months. The military value of such techniques was not lost on the territorial authorities. The records show that in 1844, the War Department dispatched Captain Robert Hollister to locate Calloway and secure his cooperation in training select scouts in his methods. Hollister's report, submitted after a 3-month search, stated that he had been unable to locate the trapper, who by then had developed an almost mythical reputation among frontiersmen. Those who claim knowledge of him speak with a respect bordering on reverence, Hollister wrote. His techniques for survival in hostile territory have apparently been shared with a select few who guard this knowledge jealously. What information I have gathered suggests his cooking method is but one component of a comprehensive approach to wilderness survival that emphasizes leaving minimal traces of human presence. Hollister's report noted that several military scouts claimed to have learned variations of Calloway's method, though none would demonstrate the technique without direct orders. This reluctance suggested the value they placed on such knowledge. It was considered a tactical advantage too valuable to be widely shared. The report recommended further efforts to document these methods for military application, though subsequent records indicate these recommendations were not immediately acted upon due to budget constraints and shifting priorities on the frontier. The territorial hearings of 1869 that brought these accounts to light were ostensibly about a dispute over trapping rights in the Wind River Range. 5 different witnesses independently testified to having learned variations of Calloway's cooking method, each claiming it had saved their lives during difficult winters. The consistency of their descriptions, despite having encountered Calloway years apart and in different locations, lent credibility to accounts that might otherwise have been dismissed as frontier exaggeration. Judge Harrington, who presided over the hearings, was sufficiently impressed to order detailed documentation of the method for the territorial records. His written opinion noted that such techniques represented important frontier knowledge that should be preserved. While much has been made of the weapons and traps used by those who first ventured into these territories, he wrote, too little attention has been paid to the more subtle arts of survival that often proved more valuable than any rifle or knife. The historical significance of these hearings extends beyond the specific cooking technique they documented. They provide a rare window into the transmission of practical knowledge in frontier society, how innovation spread among isolated individuals through direct demonstration rather than written instruction. This oral tradition of survival knowledge represented a parallel but largely undocumented aspect of Western expansion, one that influenced success or failure as much as the more celebrated factors of courage, determination, or luck. What emerges from these combined accounts is a remarkably complete picture of Calloway's cooking pit and its operation. The primary chamber was dug to a depth of approximately 18 inches with a diameter of 10 to 12 inches. This chamber was lined with flat stones, carefully selected for their ability to withstand heat without fracturing. Special attention was paid to creating a stable base at the bottom of the pit, where the cooking fire would be built. The secondary chamber, which served as the air intake, was smaller, approximately 8 inches in diameter, and dug at a downward angle to meet the main chamber at its base. This design created a natural draft that pulled air through the system, feeding the fire and creating the intense heat needed for efficient cooking. The intake tunnel was also lined with stone to prevent collapse and increase efficiency. The genius of this design lay in its application of principles that would not be formally understood in engineering terms until decades later. The angled intake tunnel created what modern stove designers would call a rocket stove effect, drawing air into the fire at the precise point where it was needed for combustion. This increased efficiency and reduced smoke production to nearly zero when properly operated. According to multiple accounts, Callaway would begin by building a small hot fire in the main chamber using only dry, seasoned wood broken into pieces no larger than a man's thumb. This initial fire would heat the stones lining the pit. Once they were sufficiently hot, he would remove most of the burning wood, leaving only a small bed of coals at the bottom. Food, typically meat, but sometimes tubers or other wild plants, would be wrapped first in large leaves, then in a layer of damp clay, if available. This package would be placed on the hot stones and covered with more heated rocks. A flat stone lid would then be placed over the main chamber and sealed with mud or clay, leaving only a small vent hole that could be adjusted to control airflow or closed completely to extinguish the fire. What made this method revolutionary was not just its efficiency, but its near invisibility. With the pit properly sealed, virtually no smoke escaped. The small amount that did was thin and dispersed quickly, unlike the heavy smoke from conventional campfires that could be seen for miles. Additionally, the sealed chamber contained cooking odors that might otherwise attract predators or human enemies. The territorial records include testimony from George Blackwood, a former Army scout who claimed to have used a variation of Callaway's method during the tensions with certain tribes in the late 1840s. The conventional wisdom, he testified, was that one couldn't have hot food in hostile territory without giving away one's position. Callaway proved that wrong. With his method, a man could prepare a hot meal even when surrounded by potential enemies, maintaining both his strength and his security. Blackwood's testimony included an account of surviving for 3 weeks in a narrow valley while being actively hunted by a hostile war party. Each night, he stated, I was able to prepare hot food using Callaway's method. The pit produced no visible smoke and contained the scent of cooking. Meanwhile, my pursuers were reduced to eating cold rations or risking detection with conventional fires. The advantage this gave me cannot be overstated. The versatility of Callaway's cooking method was another factor in its value to frontiersmen. According to various testimonies, it could be adapted for different cooking styles depending on need. For quick cooking, the food package could be placed directly on the hot coals. For slower, more thorough cooking, it could be surrounded entirely by heated stones and left for hours, similar to modern slow cooking techniques. This flexibility made it suitable for a wide range of frontier foods. Tough, sinewy meat from game animals could be rendered tender and palatable through slow cooking. Root vegetables, difficult to digest when raw, could be thoroughly cooked without the need for boiling water, a significant advantage in areas where containers were limited and water was scarce or needed to be kept for drinking. Several witnesses described how Callaway would use his pit to prepare entire meals at once, meat, tubers, and wild greens layered together in a single cooking package. This efficient use of fuel and effort produced variety in a frontier diet often characterized by monotony. The quality of meals prepared using this method was remarked upon by multiple witnesses, who noted that the sealed cooking environment preserved flavors and nutrients that were often lost in more conventional cooking methods. The practical advantages extended beyond stealth. In the high country, where timber was often scarce and the cold intense, fuel efficiency was a matter of life and death. Traditional campfires consumed large quantities of wood, a resource that could take hours to gather in snowy conditions. Callaway's method used a fraction of the fuel while producing more usable heat for cooking. Samuel Reston's testimony included specific observations about this efficiency. "I kept careful account during my time with Callaway," he stated. His cooking pit could prepare a meal sufficient for 2 men using only what wood 1 man could carry in his arms. A conventional fire would have required 3 or 4 times that amount. In deep winter, when gathering wood meant breaking trail through snow up to a man's waist, this efficiency often meant the difference between eating hot food and going hungry. The territorial records also contain an intriguing reference to how Callaway stored cooked food. According to Reston, the trapper would sometimes prepare several days' worth of meals at once, wrapping the cooked meat in layers of leaves and burying it near the cooking pit, where residual heat kept it from freezing solid. This method allowed him to have readily accessible food without needing to cook daily, another advantage when moving through contested territory. Equally significant was Callaway's approach to food preparation. The territorial records include detailed descriptions of how he would prepare meat before cooking, using techniques that preserved nutrients and enhanced flavor. Game would be carefully butchered and excess fat removed, not discarded, but rendered separately for use in preserving other foods or waterproofing leather. Organs like liver and heart would be consumed soon after the kill, recognized for their nutritional value long before scientific understanding of vitamins. He applied the same methodical thinking to every aspect of wilderness survival, Reston testified. Nothing was wasted, nothing was done without purpose. He'd studied the techniques of various tribes, yes, but he hadn't simply copied them. He'd analyzed why they worked, then improved upon them based on his own observations and needs. This systematic approach extended to site selection. According to multiple testimonies, Callaway would establish his cooking pits in locations that offered natural sound dampening, such as against rock faces or earthen banks that would absorb and diffuse the minimal sounds produced during cooking. He preferred sites near water sources, but never immediately adjacent to them, knowing that streams and rivers were natural travel corridors that increased the risk of unexpected encounters. The territorial records include a deposition from Harold McPherson, a trader who claimed to have exchanged supplies for knowledge of Callaway's technique in the winter of 1840. McPherson's testimony provided additional details about the trapper's method for disguising his cooking sites. He would always restore the area completely after use, McPherson stated. The earth removed during excavation would be placed on a hide or blanket, then returned to the pit when he was finished. He'd replace the surface vegetation so carefully that even a man standing directly over the site would notice nothing unusual. This attention to detail reflected a fundamental principle of Callaway's approach to frontier survival. Preparation and prevention were always preferable to reaction and remedy. By investing time in proper site selection, careful construction, and meticulous concealment, he avoided the kinds of emergencies that claimed the lives of less methodical men. McPherson's testimony also included observations about how Callaway would modify his cooking technique based on seasonal conditions. In summer, when the risk of forest fires was highest, he would dig deeper pits and use smaller fires. In winter, when the ground was frozen, he would select sites where soil remained workable, often on south-facing slopes protected from the worst of the cold. This adaptability was another hallmark of his approach, reflecting an understanding that survival techniques must evolve with changing conditions rather than being rigidly applied regardless of circumstance. What impressed me most, McPherson stated, was not just the cooking method itself, but the thoughtfulness behind it. Callaway had considered aspects of the process that most men would overlook entirely. He'd asked himself not just how to cook without smoke, but how to leave no trace of having done so, how to use the minimum necessary resources, how to extract maximum nutrition from limited ingredients. It was this thoroughness of thought that set his approach apart from mere tricks or shortcuts. The contrast between Callaway's approach and that of many other frontiersmen was highlighted in the testimony of Thomas Byrne, who described an encounter with a group of trappers in the winter of 1841. These were experienced men, he stated, yet they had established their camp in a location that required large fires for warmth and cooking. They were visible from miles away, and the smell of their food carried on the wind. Within a week, half their horses had been taken by raiders, and they were fortunate not to lose their lives as well. By comparison, Byrne noted that during 3 weeks in Callaway's company, they encountered the same band of raiders twice, but were never detected, despite being less than half a mile from the war party on one occasion. It wasn't magic, Byrne testified. It was method, careful site selection, disciplined fire management, and techniques like his cooking pit that minimized visible signs of our presence. This methodical approach extended to every aspect of wilderness living. According to multiple testimonies, Callaway maintained several small caches throughout his territory, each containing emergency supplies that could sustain him if he was cut off from his main camp. These caches were concealed with the same attention to detail that characterized his cooking sites, buried beneath rocks or trees with natural markers that only he would recognize. He never relied on memory alone, Reston testified. He kept a small journal with coded references to his cache locations, writing in a cipher of his own devising. He claimed this habit had saved his life more than once, when injury or disorientation might otherwise have prevented him from locating critical supplies. This was another example of his foresight, planning for contingencies that most men preferred not to contemplate. The effectiveness of Callaway's approach was perhaps most clearly demonstrated during the harsh winter of 1842-1843, which claimed the lives of numerous trappers and settlers throughout the territories. According to the territorial records, at least 7 men independently credited their survival to techniques learned directly or indirectly from Callaway, particularly his cooking method, which allowed them to prepare hot food even in the most adverse conditions. One of these survivors, James Harrington, no relation to the judge, provided a detailed account of weathering the worst of the winter in a narrow canyon that offered shelter from the winds, but little in the way of firewood. Without that hot food, I doubt I would have maintained the strength needed to ultimately make my way back to the settlement. Harrington's testimony included a poignant comparison between his experience and that of 2 other trappers who had sought shelter in the same canyon but refused to adopt what they dismissed as Indian tricks. According to his account, these men initially mocked his careful construction of a cooking pit, preferring to build traditional fires that consumed their wood supply rapidly. Had I relied on conventional fires, he testified, I would have exhausted my wood supply within a week. Using Callaway's method, I was able to cook daily for nearly a month on what wood I could gather within 50 yards of my shelter. As their resources dwindled, they were forced to venture farther for fuel, eventually attempting to traverse a high ridge during a blizzard. Neither returned. Their pride cost them their lives, Harrington stated bluntly. They could not accept that there might be better ways than those they had always known, even when the evidence was before their eyes. Callaway had no such blindness. He adopted what worked, regardless of its origin or how it might appear to others. That wisdom, more than any specific technique, was what separated him from most men on the frontier. What makes Callaway's story particularly compelling is how it challenges the conventional narrative of frontier life. Popular accounts tend to emphasize either rugged individualism or communal cooperation. But Callaway represented something different, a methodical, almost scientific approach to wilderness survival that drew on multiple cultural traditions while improving upon them through careful observation and experimentation. The territorial records suggest that by 1845, variations of Callaway's cooking method had spread among a small community of mountain men and scouts who valued its advantages. However, this knowledge remained relatively contained, shared selectively with those who demonstrated both need and the discipline to apply it properly. This selective transmission helped preserve the technique's value for those who relied on it, while explaining why it never became common knowledge in broader frontier society. Several testimonies mention Callaway's reluctance to share his methods with those who might use them carelessly or fail to appreciate their underlying principles. According to William Hargreaves, the trapper would sometimes test potential students by observing their camp practices before deciding whether to demonstrate his cooking technique. Those who showed wastefulness or inattention to detail were deemed unlikely to properly implement or maintain the method, and were left to their conventional approaches. He believed that knowledge carried responsibility, Hargreaves stated. To teach a man a method without ensuring he understood its purpose and proper application was, in Callaway's view, worse than teaching him nothing at all. An improperly constructed cooking pit could collapse, causing injury or starting fires. A carelessly concealed site could lead enemies to the user. He would not risk such outcomes by sharing indiscriminately. This selective approach to knowledge transmission reflected a broader philosophy that valued quality over quantity, thoroughness over expediency. It stood in stark contrast to the often haphazard, trial-and-error approach that characterized much of frontier life, where techniques were frequently adopted without full understanding of their principles or limitations. The historical record falls largely silent on Callaway himself after 1846. The last documented encounter comes from a military dispatch, noting that a scout matching his description had been seen traveling westward toward the Oregon Territory. Whether he continued his solitary existence in new territories or eventually settled in one of the growing western communities remains unknown. Some local histories include references to a trapper who established a small trading post near the Idaho-Oregon border in the early 1850s, teaching unusual cooking methods to friendly tribes in the region. While these accounts contain elements consistent with what is known of Callaway, they lack the documentary evidence needed to establish a definitive connection. Like many frontier figures, his ultimate fate remains a matter of speculation rather than historical certainty. What survived, however, was his method, preserved in the territorial records and in the oral traditions of certain frontier families. When amateur historian Robert Fleming discovered these accounts during archival research in 1957, he was initially skeptical of their authenticity. The level of detail and engineering insight described seemed anachronistic for the 1830s-40s frontier. However, subsequent archaeological investigations at sites mentioned in the testimonies uncovered the remains of cooking pits that matched the descriptions in remarkable detail. Fleming's excavations in the Wind River Range in 1959 revealed stone-lined pits with angled intake tunnels exactly as described in the territorial records. Carbon dating of charcoal remains from these sites confirmed their use during the period in question. The physical evidence not only validated the historical accounts, but provided additional insights into how these structures were constructed and maintained over multiple seasons. In 1962, Fleming published his findings in the Journal of Western History, bringing Callaway's cooking method to academic attention for the first time. The article attracted interest not just from historians but from military survival specialists, who recognized the technique's potential applications. Modern testing confirmed what the territorial records had claimed. The method produced minimal smoke, contained cooking odors, and used significantly less fuel than conventional campfires. This rediscovery highlighted an important aspect of frontier history that had been largely overlooked: the development and transmission of specialized survival knowledge that often made the difference between life and death in harsh environments. While popular accounts emphasized dramatic conflicts and heroic endeavors, The reality of daily survival often depended on more subtle skills like those Callaway had perfected. The story of Jeremiah "Silent Cal" Callaway and his smokeless, scent-containing cooking pit offers a window into this less celebrated but crucially important aspect of frontier life. It reminds us that behind the more dramatic narratives of exploration and conquest were individuals who approached wilderness survival as a discipline requiring careful study, innovation, and attention to detail. In the harsh reality of the frontier, where a single mistake could prove fatal, Callaway's methodical approach represented a form of wisdom that deserves recognition alongside the more celebrated aspects of pioneer spirit. His cooking technique, developed through careful observation and refined through practical experience, embodied the very best of frontier innovation, an elegant solution to a complex problem, achieved with minimal resources but maximum ingenuity. The true legacy of Callaway's method lies not just in its practical applications, but in what it represents: the importance of preparation over improvisation, of systematic knowledge over luck, of prevention over reaction. In a frontier environment that often glorified bold action and physical courage, Callaway's approach emphasized careful planning and methodical execution, qualities that might have seemed less heroic but often proved more valuable for long-term survival. This perspective offers important insights for modern understanding of frontier history. Too often, the narrative of westward expansion has focused on moments of crisis and conflict, overlooking the quieter but equally significant stories of those who succeeded through foresight and careful adaptation to challenging environments. Callaway's story serves as a corrective to this imbalance, highlighting the intellectual dimensions of frontier survival that are frequently overshadowed by more dramatic elements. The cooking pit that Callaway developed represents more than just an innovative method for preparing food in difficult circumstances. It embodies a particular approach to problem-solving that characterized the best of frontier adaptation, one that combined respect for indigenous knowledge with practical experimentation and systematic improvement. This willingness to learn from diverse sources, to test and refine techniques based on observed results rather than preconceived notions, enabled successful adaptation to environments that defeated those with less flexible mindsets. Perhaps most significantly, Callaway's story challenges the popular image of the mountain man as a figure defined primarily by physical prowess and instinctive reactions to danger. While these qualities certainly had their place in frontier survival, the more successful individuals, those who thrived rather than merely survived, often possessed intellectual capacities that have received less attention in historical accounts. The ability to analyze problems systematically, to plan for contingencies, to improve upon existing methods through careful observation, these were skills as valuable as marksmanship or physical endurance in the unforgiving western wilderness. The selective transmission of Callaway's cooking method also illuminates aspects of frontier knowledge systems that historical accounts have often neglected. Unlike formal education with its written texts and institutional structures, practical survival knowledge on the frontier was typically shared through demonstration and guided practice, with careful attention to the recipient's ability to apply the knowledge appropriately. This apprenticeship model, while limiting the spread of information, ensured that techniques were passed to those most likely to implement them correctly and preserve their value for future users. Judge Harrington perhaps summarized it best in his concluding remarks to the 1869 territorial hearing. "We would do well to remember that for every tale of dramatic rescue or narrow escape that captures public imagination, there are countless instances where disaster was avoided entirely through proper preparation and technique." In this regard, the cooking method described in these testimonies stands as a testament to the kind of frontier wisdom that seldom makes its way into popular accounts, but has always been the true foundation of successful settlement in these territories. The judge's insight points to a broader truth about historical memory, that we tend to commemorate moments of crisis overcome rather than crises prevented, celebrating reactive heroism while overlooking the less dramatic but often more valuable work of prevention. Callaway's approach to wilderness survival, with its emphasis on foresight and preparation, represents this less celebrated but ultimately more sustainable form of frontier wisdom. In modern archaeological work, the remnants of cooking pits like those described in the Callaway testimonies have been identified across the Western Territories, though often misinterpreted as simple fire pits or storage caches. Fleming's research prompted a re-evaluation of these findings, revealing a more sophisticated understanding of thermal engineering among certain frontiersmen than had previously been recognized. This reassessment has contributed to a more nuanced understanding of the technical knowledge that supported westward expansion, knowledge that went well beyond the simple tools and weapons that have received the bulk of historical attention. Today, when we consider the challenges faced by those who ventured into the western wilderness, we should remember not just those who overcame adversity through feats of strength or courage, but also those like Callaway who survived through observation, innovation, and methodical application of hard-won knowledge. Their legacy reminds us that in the unforgiving environment of the frontier, preparation was not just prudent, it was essential. The cooking pit that kept one solitary trapper fed through harsh winters in hostile territory may seem a small innovation compared to the grand narratives of westward expansion. Yet in its elegance and effectiveness, it represents the kind of practical ingenuity that made survival possible in even the most challenging circumstances, a legacy of frontier wisdom worth preserving for future generations. In the decades following Fleming's rediscovery, survival experts and outdoor enthusiasts have experimented with reconstructions of Callaway's cooking pit, confirming its remarkable efficiency and near-smokeless operation when properly constructed. Modern adaptations have found applications in wilderness survival training, archaeological experimentation, and historical reenactments, introducing new generations to this forgotten frontier innovation. Perhaps the most fitting tribute to Callaway's legacy is not the preservation of his specific technique, though that certainly has value, but the perpetuation of the approach it represents: careful observation, methodical testing, willingness to learn from diverse sources, and the discipline to implement solutions thoroughly rather than haphazardly. In a world that often prizes quick fixes and immediate results, there is much to learn from the mountain man who understood that true mastery came through patience, attention to detail, and respect for the unforgiving realities of the natural world. As we close this account of Jeremiah Silent Cal Callaway and his remarkable cooking innovation, we might reflect on how many other such stories remain buried in fragmentary records and oral traditions, waiting to be rediscovered and appreciated. The frontier experience was rich with such examples of practical problem-solving as individuals from diverse backgrounds confronted unprecedented challenges with limited resources but unlimited ingenuity. In honoring Callaway's contribution to frontier survival techniques, we honor also the countless unnamed innovators whose adaptations and improvements made life possible in challenging environments. Their collective legacy reminds us that history is made not just in moments of dramatic conflict or political decision, but in the quiet, daily work of solving practical problems and passing that knowledge to others who might benefit from it. The cooking pit that produced no smoke and left no scent stands as a metaphor for this less visible but essential dimension of historical change. Innovations that transformed daily life without fanfare, wisdom transmitted without formal recognition, techniques refined through practice rather than theory. In acknowledging these contributions, we develop a richer, more complete understanding of how human communities have adapted to new environments and overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges throughout our shared history.